The day began like every other day on the small, quiet farm tucked at the edge of the old forest. The air was cool, the earth smelled fresh, and the wind whispered softly through the tall grass. For more than 50 years, Edward and Margaret had lived here, just the two of them, side by side, with no siblings, no children, and no family to lean on. People often wondered how they survived without anyone by their side. They didn't understand that Edward and Margaret had something most families never found, a love strong enough to replace an entire world. Their days were simple but beautiful. Every morning, Edward woke before sunrise, stepping outside with his old boots and worn jacket. Margaret followed later with warm tea, calling out to him gently as she walked across the small garden. They harvested vegetables themselves. They carried with themselves. They went to the market themselves. They fixed fences, repaired the roof, stacked hay, planted seeds, cooked meals, together. Sometimes the work was so heavy that Margaret's back ached and Edward's hands swelled. But even then they smiled, because they were doing it for each other, and that made every hardship feel lighter. But even in the happiest lives, storms find their way in. And on this particular evening, a storm neither of them expected was brewing. Edward left the house early that morning to check the far end of their land, where a large old oak tree had been leaning dangerously. He promised Margaret he would return by afternoon, but time slipped away like sand through fingers. By noon, clouds gathered and stacked on top of each other like mountains. By afternoon, the wind grew harsher. By late evening, the sky turned black. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, her hands trembling as she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The rain had started as a soft drizzle, but soon grew into heavy sheets slamming against the house. Thunder rumbled like the growl of a beast. She whispered to herself, "Where are you, Edward?" Her voice broke. She walked to the door, opened it, and stepped into the cold wind. The storm slapped against her face, but fear was stronger than the weather. She peered into the darkness, hoping to see the familiar silhouette of her husband walking toward the house. Nothing, just a roar of rain, just the emptiness of night. Margaret's heart began to pound harder. Minutes turned to hours. Margaret lit a lantern and placed outside the door, a warm glow fighting the storm's darkness. She paced the living room. She prayed. She wiped tears from her face again and again, her breath shaky. The clock struck 8, then 9, then 10. By now, Edward should have been home long ago. He never stayed out this late, not in good weather, and definitely not during a storm like this. Margaret felt a fear she hadn't felt in decades, a fear of losing the only person she had left in the world, because without Edward, she had no one, no brother, no sister, no son, no daughter, no relative to call, no neighbor nearby, just an empty house, and the wind howling like a warning. She whispered, her voice breaking, "Please come back to me." Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her teacup. It was almost midnight when she finally gave up searching the window. Her legs felt weak, her body cold and exhausted. She leaned against the doorframe, tears falling silently. Then, suddenly, the doorbell rang. A sharp, trembling sound cutting through the storm. Ding, dong. Margaret froze. Was it real, or was her mind playing tricks? The bell rang again, this time weaker, almost pleading. She rushed forward and yanked the door open. There he was, her Edward, standing in the rain, trembling, soaked to the bone. His umbrella was ripped apart, hanging in pieces. His jacket was torn. His hand shook violently as he struggled to stay upright. Margaret gasped, grabbing him before he collapsed. "Edward! Oh, God, Edward! What happened?" He tried to speak, but his voice came out in broken breaths. I slipped. The ground was muddy. Tree fell. I tried to get back." His teeth chattered uncontrollably. He could barely stay standing. Margaret pulled him inside, holding his face with both hands as tears streamed down her cheeks. "You scared me. You scared me so much." Her voice cracked with a pain only true love knows. Edward looked at her with weak, tired eyes. I'm sorry. I didn't want you to worry." She hugged him tightly, her body shaking. I wish, she whispered through tears, I wish we had someone, just one person, who could help us, who could care for us when we're old. Her words cut through the silence like a blade, not because she meant them out of anger, but because she meant them out of heartbreak. Edward's eyes softened, tears mixing with raindrops on his cheeks. We only ever had each other, he whispered back, and that has always been enough. But even as he said it, something in his voice hinted that perhaps the storm had brought more than just rain. It had brought something darker, something hidden, something that would soon reveal itself. The storm had finally begun to fade, leaving a soft drizzle that tapped lightly against the roof and windows. But inside the small farmhouse, the echoes of fear and tension remained. Margaret wrapped a thick blanket around Edward as he shivered in the corner, dripping wet, while the fire crackled weakly in the hearth. Neither spoke at first. The storm outside had passed, but its memory lingered like a shadow across the room. The house felt smaller than usual, the silence heavier. Margaret could still feel the cold dampness of his clothes pressed against her hands. Edward tried to pull himself together, but his hands shook uncontrollably. He avoided Margaret's eyes, staring into the fire, as if searching for courage in the flames. Margaret's heart ached. She could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face, every tremor in his fingers. Finally, she spoke softly. Edward, tell me exactly what happened out there. He swallowed hard. The words didn't come easily. I walked along the ridge to check the old fence. The storm had washed so much mud onto the path. I slipped, and then I saw them. Margaret's breath caught. Them? Edward nodded slowly, eyes wide and fixed on the floor. Yes, someone else was out there. Walking or running. I couldn't tell. Only their footprints. Fresh, deep in the mud. Margaret felt her stomach twist. For years, they had lived alone, isolated. There had never been anyone else wandering near the farm. Yet here in the mud were traces of another person. They weren't careful, Edward continued. It was like they were desperate. I tried to follow for a while, to see where they were going, but the storm, it was too strong, and then I lost them. Margaret's hands gripped his shoulders. Edward, are you saying there was someone else here near our home tonight? Edward nodded again, looking more fragile than she had ever seen him. I think they might have dropped something. A bag. I saw it in the mud. Didn't touch it. Too afraid. But it looked heavy and important. Margaret's heart raced. Someone in the valley at night during a storm, and they left behind a mysterious bag. She felt a cold, creeping fear. Edward's voice was quiet now, almost a whisper. I covered the footprints the best I could. Margaret, branches, mud. The rain helped. No one should be able to find it. Hopefully. Margaret shook her head. Edward, we have no one to help us. No one. If they come back, what will we do? Edward took her hands, trying to steady them, and himself. We survive like we always have, he said. His voice was calm, almost brave, but she could hear the trembling beneath it. We face it together. Margaret leaned her forehead against his chest, tears mixing with the drizzle still clinging to his coat. I don't want anyone to hurt you. Not now, not ever. We fought storms, worked this land, built a life. I can't bear losing you to strangers. Edward kissed her forehead. And you won't. We are stronger than any storm, Margaret. We have each other. But even as he said it, he felt the weight of fear pressing into him. Something about the footprints, about the dropped bag, about the mysterious figure in the storm. It wasn't over. It never would be. Margaret's eyes drifted toward the window. The mud path was dark now, almost indistinguishable in the rain-soaked earth. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still out there, watching, waiting. Edward rose slowly, exhausted but alert. He began to check the doors and windows, ensuring they were secure. Margaret followed, her hand clutching his as if to anchor herself against the rising dread. Then Edward stopped, eyes narrowing the doorway to the porch. I thought I heard something, he murmured. Margaret froze. The sound was faint, a soft crunch in the mud outside. They held their breath, straining to listen. Another faint step, then silence. Edward shook his head. Maybe it's just a wind, but his voice trailed off, uneasy. Margaret's heart pounded. If someone comes, we're alone. Just the two of us. We have to be ready. Edward nodded. We survive together, no matter what. They returned to the living room, securing the windows and doors as best they could. Every shadow in the flickering firelight seemed to stretch and twist into shapes. Every small creak of the house sounded like someone moving in the storm. They sat together, holding each other, listening to the dripping water outside, the occasional gust of wind, the distant roll of thunder. And they waited for hours. And somewhere in the dark, someone or something was moving. The night stretched long and heavy over the farmhouse. Edward and Margaret had secured the doors and windows as best they could, but the wind outside seemed to whisper secrets only the storm knew. Every shadow in the flickering firelight made Margaret jump. Every small creak in the floorboards made Edward tense. They sat close together on the worn couch, Margaret holding Edward's hand, feeling the wet chill from his storm-soaked clothes. Their silence was thick, filled with unspoken fear. Suddenly, the faintest sound broke the quiet. Tap, tap, tap. Margaret froze. Her grip on Edward's hand tightened. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Edward strained his ears. The sound came again, soft, deliberate, from the front door. Neither of them moved at first. They held their breath, listening. The storm had passed, yet the air outside carried a tension that was almost human. Another tap, louder this time. Edward shook his head slowly. No one should be out there, not in this weather. Not anyone. Margaret's chest tightened. But someone is, Edward. Someone is out there. We're not alone. Another tap, and then a voice, low, urgent, barely above a whisper. "Please help me." Margaret's heart leapt. Edward's face paled. "Who?" he stammered. "No one knows we live here. No one comes this far." The doorbell rang again, trembling against the storm's memory. Margaret rushed forward, hesitating only a moment before opening the door. A man stood there, dripping wet, clothes torn and muddied, umbrella shredded, his hands shaking violently. Rainwater ran down his face in thin streams, mixing with dirt. His eyes were wide, desperate, almost pleading. Margaret gasped. Who are you?" The man took a hesitant step forward, his voice low and trembling. I need shelter. Please?" "I was caught in the storm." Edward stepped beside Margaret, shielding her instinctively. "This is our home." "Who are you? How did you find us?" The stranger hesitated, glancing nervously at the house, then at Edward. I didn't mean to intrude. I got lost the storm. I didn't know where else to go." Margaret's mind raced. She could sense the fear, the exhaustion, the desperation. But something about him made her uneasy. Edward's hands were trembling slightly as he clenched them together. "You're soaking wet," Margaret said softly, trying to calm herself. "Come in. Quickly." The man stepped inside, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to follow him. Margaret felt a chill despite the warmth of the fire. Once inside, Edward helped the man remove his soaked coat, placing a blanket over his shoulders. The stranger's hand shook uncontrollably as he tried to explain himself. I saw your house, the light. I thought maybe someone could help me." He swallowed hard. "I didn't want trouble. Edward's gaze narrowed. "Help you with what? What happened to you out there?" The man's eyes darted toward the window, then back to the floor. I lost something important, and I was being followed. I didn't know where else to go." Margaret's heart thumped in her chest. She felt the familiar tension rising, like the storm was building again, but inside the house. She could see Edward's worry mirrored in her own eyes. "Lost something? Followed?" Edward asked carefully. "Yes," the man whispered. "I dropped it in the mud. I don't know what they saw me, but they're dangerous. They don't forgive mistakes." Margaret shivered. "Who are they?" "What do you mean?" The man didn't answer immediately. His gaze flicked nervously toward the door, then at the fire. I can't explain everything. Not yet. But please, I just need to stay here until they pass. I'll leave at first light. Edward exchanged a glance with Margaret. The man seemed genuine, but something about him unsettled both of them. Margaret could feel her pulse racing. You must rest, Edward said finally, his voice steady despite the unease. We can't just leave you outside in the storm. But tell me, if someone is following you, why are they after you? The man hesitated, swallowing hard, before finally speaking. It's complicated, but I lost something important tonight, and they won't forgive me. Please, just until morning. Margaret led him to a chair near the fire, giving him a dry blanket and a cup of tea. He accepted it with shaking hands. The three of them sat in uneasy silence, the only sounds a crackle of the fire and the wind tapping against the windows. Edward and Margaret exchanged glances, both wondering, had the storm brought this man here by accident, or had fate thrown danger into their home deliberately? Margaret pressed a hand to Edward's arm. We've survived everything together, she whispered. We'll survive this too. Edward nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that the night was far from over. Whoever or whatever was following the stranger might soon be at their doorstep, and for the first time in decades, both Edward and Margaret realized their quiet life, their peaceful isolation, was about to be shattered. The fire crackled softly, filling the farmhouse with a warm, comforting glow. Yet outside, the remnants of the storm still whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves and shaking the shutters. Inside, Edward and Margaret sat tense, watching the stranger, who now introduced himself as Thomas, sip his tea. His hands were still trembling, and his eyes darted nervously toward the door and windows. Margaret's heart raced. She wanted to believe Thomas was harmless, but the fear that had settled in her chest refused to leave. You can stay here for the night, Edward said carefully, but you must tell us everything. Why are they after you? Thomas swallowed. His eyes flicked toward the door again, and he whispered, I can't. Not everything. Not yet. But they're dangerous. They'll come. Soon. Margaret's stomach twisted. Who is coming? How do you know? Before Thomas could answer, a faint sound broke the uneasy quiet. Thump, thump, thump. Margaret froze. Edward's jaw tightened. The sound came from the front door. Someone's there, Edward whispered. Thomas stiffened, his tea trembling in his hands. They've found me, he said quietly. I knew it would happen sooner or later. I didn't know when, but... Bang! The door shook violently. Margaret clutched Edward's arm. Edward, what do we do? Edward moved quickly, securing the bolt on the door. The farmhouse was old. The lock wasn't strong enough to withstand much force. He looked at Thomas. Do you know who they are? Thomas nodded, eyes wide. At least 2, maybe 3. They won't leave until they get what I have, or find me. Margaret's mind raced. They had always lived peacefully, just the 2 of them surviving on their farm. Now, danger had arrived at their doorstep. They're dangerous, Thomas repeated. I can't let them see you. If they find you, they won't stop. They'll... Another violent thump on the door interrupted him. Edward braced himself, gripping the wooden door frame. Margaret moved behind him, her hand holding tightly onto his coat. The sound was closer now, heavier. The doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to force their way in. Margaret's heart pounded. Edward, they're going to break it. Thomas's eyes darted to window. Back door. Quick. Edward shook his head. No time. Whoever it is, they'll notice. Another thump, louder this time. The door creaked and splintered slightly. Rainwater seeped through the cracks. The tension was unbearable. Margaret's fingers dug into Edward's sleeve. Thomas whispered urgently, You have to hide something, anything? Don't let them see it. Edward's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? They want the bag, Thomas said. I dropped it earlier in the mud. I didn't take it inside, but if they think it's here... His voice broke off, fear evident. Margaret swallowed hard. What bag? What is in it? Thomas shook his head. It's complicated. I shouldn't even have it. They sent me to deliver it. I ran, but I can't explain more. Not here. Not now. Another bang. The door shuddered under force. Edward's knuckles turned white as he braced against it. Margaret could feel the vibration in her chest. "Edward, they're going to come in," she cried. Thomas held up his hands. "They won't stop. Not for anything. Not even for me. You have to protect yourselves." Margaret looked at Edward, her eyes wide with fear and determination. They had faced every hardship together, every storm and every lonely winter. But now, something worse than weather threatened them. Something human, real, dangerous. Edward's voice was low, steady, and full of resolve. "We've survived everything together, Margaret. We'll survive this too, no matter what." The door shook again, stronger this time. Splinters flew into the hallway. The strangers outside were not hesitating. They were determined. Margaret pressed herself against Edward, tears mixing with the fear in her chest. "We're alone," she whispered. "No one will come for us." Edward held her closer. "Then we fight, together, just like always." Thomas sank lower into the chair, his eyes darting from the door to Edward and Margaret. "I never meant to bring this danger to you," he said. "But they won't leave, and soon it won't matter what we do." The tension was unbearable. Outside, the shadows of the storm stretched across the front porch like long, dark fingers. Another thump, then silence. The three of them held their breath. And then another sound, soft, deliberate, footsteps in the mud, coming closer. Margaret's pulse raced. Edward tightened his grip on her hand. And somewhere deep inside, she knew. This night was far from over. The storm had passed, but the real danger had only just arrived. The footsteps outside grew louder. Each step pressed into the muddy ground like a warning, vibrating through the farmhouse floor. Edward moved to the window, peering through the curtain. Shadows shifted in the rain-soaked darkness. The storm had passed, but the threat it had revealed had not. Thomas sat near the fire, still shivering, clutching a wet coat. Margaret pressed herself against Edward, her breath shallow. The three of them were trapped in the small farmhouse, the only shelter between them and whoever, or whatever, was outside. Bang! The door rattled violently. Splinters flew from the frame. Margaret screamed, but Edward held her tightly. He had faced storms, floods, and backbreaking winters, but tonight a new fear pressed against his chest. Human menace. "They won't stop," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. "They've been hunting me for weeks. They'll take anything or anyone in their way." Edward turned to him, jaw tight. "Then we make it clear they won't take us. Not tonight. Not here." Margaret's eyes widened. "Edward, we're old. We can't fight them physically." He shook his head. "It's not about strength. It's about survival. Together. We've always faced the world together." Another thump, louder this time, shook the door. A long shadow stretched across the threshold. The intruders had arrived. Edward grabbed the heavy wooden bar that kept the door shut. Margaret moved behind him. Thomas glanced nervously at the back of the house. "If they break in, I don't know what will happen," he admitted. Edward's eyes met Margaret's. "Then we do what we must, no matter what." The next moments were a blur of tension. The door shook violently under repeated blows. Dust and rainwater fell from the ceiling. Outside, deep voices shouted indistinctly, masked by the wind and rain. Edward whispered urgently, "Move, Margaret. Hide. Thomas, stay low. Stay quiet." They scrambled into the small pantry off the kitchen, just enough space to crouch. Through the cracks in walls, Margaret could see shadows moving across the living room. The intruders had broken to the first lock. Her heart pounded violently. She pressed herself against the wall, listening to every sound. The creak of wood, the snap of a floorboard, the shallow breathing of the intruder closest to the fire. Edward's voice was low but firm. "We're not giving them anything. Not our home. Not our lives." The attackers' voices grew louder, more aggressive. "He's in here," one yelled. "Search the whole place." Margaret closed her eyes, trying to control her fear. Thomas's hands were shaking as he clutched a small kitchen knife, barely able to hold it steady. Edward whispered again, "They don't know what they're facing. They don't know we've survived everything life threw at us. They don't know us. Margaret peeked through a tiny gap in the pantry wall. One of the intruders was stepping closer to the firelight, examining the room. Another moved toward the hallway, the sound of boots echoing on the wooden floor. Suddenly, the man by the fire froze. Thomas's eyes widened. He whispered urgently, "They're looking for it. The bag, they think it's here." Edward's heart sank. He didn't know what was in the bag. He only knew Thomas had been followed. But the intruder's obsession with it made them more dangerous than anything Edward had ever faced. The tension reached its peak. The intruders began breaking furniture, looking frantically for something. The farmhouse shook under their force. Margaret's hand tightened around Edward's arm. Edward whispered, "We protect each other. That's all that matters. Just hold on, Margaret. Just hold on." Hours seemed to stretch into eternity. Outside, the intruders' voices became muffled as they moved through the house, searching. The wind and rain made it hard to hear them clearly, but every small sound was magnified in the silence of farmhouse. Then, suddenly quiet, Edward and Margaret exchanged glances. The intruders had stopped moving. They were somewhere in the house, waiting, or planning their next move. Thomas whispered, voice barely audible, "They're thinking, maybe waiting for me to panic." Edward gritted his teeth. "They don't know who we are. They don't know how strong we are. They think fear will control us, but it won't. Not here. Not in our home." Margaret held him tightly, whispering through tears, "Edward, I don't know if I can survive losing you." Edward kissed the top of her head. "You won't lose me. Not tonight. I promise you." The farmhouse was silent, except for the soft drip of water from the storm and the faint creak of old wood. But Margaret could feel the danger lingering like a shadow, ready to strike at any moment. And in that silence, she realized the storm outside was over, but the real battle had only just begun. Dawn crept slowly over the farm, the sun struggling to push through thick, gray clouds. The storm had passed entirely, leaving the air damp and heavy. Edward and Margaret were exhausted, emotionally, physically, and mentally, but the night's events had left a weight that would not lift so easily. Thomas remained in the corner, shivering, his eyes fixed on the floor, as if trying to will himself invisible. He had barely slept, and every creak or whistle of wind outside made him flinch. Edward had insisted on checking the perimeter of the property, convinced that the intruders might have left something behind, or worse, returned silently. Margaret followed closely, her hand holding his as they stepped carefully across the mud-soaked path. The smell of wet earth filled their nostrils, mixing with a faint metallic scent of broken branches and leaves trampled in the storm. Edward stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing at the mud near the far edge of the yard. "Look," he said, crouching down. Margaret bent beside him. Fresh footprints, deep and deliberate. And nearby, partially covered in a thin layer of wet soil, was a small leather bag. Edward's pulse quickened. He glanced at Margaret, then back at Thomas, who had followed quietly. "It's them," Thomas whispered. "They dropped it during the storm, and I ran. I didn't want it to fall into their hands." Margaret's fingers trembled as she reached toward the bag, but Edward caught her hand. "Not yet. We don't know what's in it, or if it's safe. We can't just touch it blindly." Thomas swallowed. "It's dangerous. Whatever is in there, they've been hunting it for weeks. They'll kill anyone who interferes." Edward's jaw tightened. "Then we must make sure it doesn't leave this farm. Not now, not ever. We've survived storms, fire, and the harshest winters. We won't let strangers take over our lives." Margaret shivered, glancing nervously at the surrounding woods. "But Edward, what if they come back? They know it's here now. They won't give up easily." Edward looked at her, eyes fierce but gentle. "Then we prepare, just like always. Together." Thomas took a deep breath, finally deciding to reveal more. "It's not just a bag. It contains something they believe is worth killing for. I don't know exactly why yet, but it's small, but valuable to them." Margaret's heart pounded. "Why involve us? We've done nothing." Thomas shook his head. "I didn't know anyone lived here. I only sought shelter during the storm. But now, they'll think you're part of this, that you saw me, that you know the bag exists." Edward knelt beside the bag cautiously. Rainwater had soaked the leather, but it was intact. He placed a hand on it, feeling the strange weight. It was heavy, but not overly large. "Whatever it is," he said, "we protect it. No one gets it. Not them. Not anyone." Margaret bit her lip. "Edward, if they know it's here, they will come back stronger. They won't wait for a storm this time." Edward nodded slowly, his mind racing. "Then we set a trap. If they return, they'll find more than they expect." As they spoke, a sound drifted from the tree line, a soft crunch of mud, deliberate and careful. Margaret froze, clutching Edward's arm. Thomas crouched behind them, eyes wide. "They're coming," he whispered. Edward didn't speak. He held Margaret's hand and gestured for her to stay low. She could feel his fingers tighten, a silent promise. "We face this together, no matter what." From the shadows, two figures emerged, moving cautiously toward the farmhouse. The storm had washed away some of the tracks, but the intruders were skilled. They scanned the yard, their eyes sharp, and then paused near the mud where the bag rested. Margaret held her breath. Edward whispered, "Wait until they take the bait." The intruders hesitated. Then one stepped forward, reaching toward the bag. Margaret's chest felt tight. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding louder than the intruders' movements. Thomas whispered, "They'll find nothing not yet, if you trust me." Edward's eyes never left the figures. "We protect our home, and we protect each other. That's what matters most." For a moment, time seemed frozen. The farmhouse, the yard, the remnants of storm, all held intense anticipation. Then, as the first intruder bent toward the bag, Edward pulled Margaret behind the cover of the shed. Thomas moved swiftly, whispering instructions. The chase, the confrontation, and the secrets buried in the mud were about to unravel, bringing danger, revelations, and choices no one could have predicted. And in that quiet tension, Margaret realized they had survived storms, work, and decades alone, but tonight, the real test of their courage, love, and sacrifice was only beginning. The first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, casting a pale gold over the farm. The night had been long, tense, and terrifying. Edward, Margaret, and Thomas had huddled together in silence, listening to the intruders move in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to act. The farmhouse was battered. The front door was splintered, windows streaked with rain and mud. But inside, the three of them were alive. And that, Edward knew, was the most important thing. Margaret leaned against Edward, exhausted but alert. Her hands were still shaking from the adrenaline, her heart still racing from fear. "Edward, it's finally morning," she whispered. "We survived." Edward kissed the top of her head. "We always survive. Together." Thomas, however, remained tense, eyes darting toward the broken door. "They're not gone," he said quietly. "They'll come back. They know I'm here, and they'll try again." Edward's voice was steady, commanding. "Then we end it today. We confront the truth, and we stop fearing what we cannot change." Thomas finally spoke, the words spilling out like confession he had waited too long to give. "The bag, it contains documents, evidence of their crimes, corruption, bribery, theft, even violence. I was delivering it to the authorities, but they found me first. They've been chasing it, trying to silence anyone connected to it. That's why they came here." Margaret's eyes widened. "And we were caught in this because you sought shelter?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, I didn't know anyone lived here. I never wanted to bring danger to you, but now it's here, and I have no choice but to see it through." Edward's jaw tightened. "Then we finish this, no matter what it takes." Margaret swallowed hard. "Edward, we're just two old people. How can we stop them?" Edward took her hand, holding it firmly. "We have courage. We have each other. And tonight, we learned that's enough." The intruders returned just as Thomas predicted, moving silently toward the farmhouse. Edward had prepared for them. Windows secured, furniture positioned to block entrances, and a lantern lit to create shadows and confusion. As the first figure approached the mud where the bag had been hidden, Edward stepped forward, his voice firm and unwavering. "Leave this place." The intruder froze. "Who's there?" one demanded. Edward's voice rang out again. "We are the only ones here. This is our home. You will take nothing from us. Leave now." Margaret stepped beside him, her voice shaking but strong. "You are not welcome. Go back, or face the consequences." For a moment, the intruders hesitated. They had expected an empty farmhouse, an easy target. Instead, they found two determined old people and a young man who had already risked everything to protect them. The tension was unbearable. Edward could feel Margaret's hand trembling in his, but her grip was tight, strong. They were united, unyielding. The intruders, sensing resistance and perhaps fearing exposure, slowly retreated. They didn't vanish completely, but the immediate threat was gone. The sun rose higher, burning off the remaining clouds. Edward and Margaret stepped outside, surveying the mud, the broken branches, the evidence of the night's terror. Their farmhouse had survived, and so had they. Thomas retrieved the bag from its hiding place. "We can take it to the authorities now," he said. "It will stop them from coming back." Edward nodded. "And we will ensure our home remains safe. But more importantly, we face this together." Margaret rested her head against Edward's shoulder. "All these years, just the two of us, we never had siblings, never had children, never had anyone. But I realized something tonight." Edward looked at her. "What's that?" "That love is enough," she said softly. "Love and trust. That's all we need to survive the storms of life." Edward smiled faintly. "And courage," he added. "Never forget courage. Courage in each other." The morning air smelled sweet after the storm. Birds began to sing in the distance, and the first rays of sunlight glinted on the wet leaves. Edward and Margaret stood together, hands intertwined, facing their small farm. It was battered, yes, but it was still theirs. Thomas packed a bag and prepared to leave. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I never imagined I'd find shelter with people like you. I don't know how to repay you." Edward shook his head. "You don't need to. Just promise me you continue doing the right thing. That's enough." Thomas nodded, his eyes glistening. He turned and walked toward the woods, disappearing down the muddy path. Edward and Margaret remained standing, watching the sunrise together. They had faced storms, intruders, and the shadow of danger. They had survived alone, as they always had, but tonight had reminded them of the strength they had together. No siblings, no children, no family, only each other. And that, Edward realized, was more than enough. Margaret whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. "As long as we have each other, no storm, no danger can ever take us down." Edward held her close. Together, always together. The sun rose fully, spilling golden light over the farmhouse and fields. It was a new day. The storm had passed, and love, quiet, unwavering, and enduring, had prevailed.